Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Audio Signals podcast, where we talk about storytelling and stories, and also and especially storytellers, because those are my guests. They can be people that write books, people that play music, write song, do art. I mean, for me, even photography tells a story, obviously. So often we talk with writers because those are the ones that really write down the story in a traditional format, let's say. We can argue that in terms of paintings and music as well. And actually, I read something about my guest that is struggling with guitars or something like that. We'll get into that maybe. I struggle with bass and guitar and piano myself. But enough about this. I don't have enough voice, so I need to spare it today. I'm going to introduce Frank Saverio, and he goes by other Franks, and he's going to explain us why. So, Frank, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Marco. I appreciate it. Happy to be here. Yeah, I go by Frank Saverio when I write science fiction and fantasy. But probably most of my books are written under Frank Zafiro, which is my pen name for crime fiction. I'd say probably 3/4 of my books are in that major genre, with a bunch of minor genres, the subgenres in there, police procedurals, detective novels, hard-boiled, noir, the different subcategories of crime fiction. And then my actual name is Frank Scalise. And I kind of saved that for like everything else. Like I've written a couple nonfiction books in the concerned with the law enforcement realm, and then some books about hockey and some children's books, and a couple of one heartwarming humor sort of dramedy, and another one of the works there too. So try to keep the names, for the very, very different genres from each other, so nobody picks up a book expecting one thing and getting quite another.
That could be an whole conversation, in my opinion, on how some people expect, and I've talked about this before. Some people expect that when you are in a genre, when you have a character, which often happen when you write mystery or detective crime, and usually there is one character that you bring over, and you write many books about that, and then if somebody just come up, and I don't know, it's J.K. Rowling. She had to get a pen name to write something different than Harry Potter. I'm like, why do you think that's important? Obviously, you must think that's important because you've done it. So,
yeah, I mean, I think there's an unspoken contract between readers and writers that, here's in general what you're going to get. You obviously, people like to be surprised, so they don't want to know the whole package up front, but they want to know they're getting a private detective mystery, or they want to know they're getting a police procedural with an ensemble cast, or they want to know they're getting a science fiction novel. They don't want to pick up a book expecting a cozy where a grandmother with a cat for a sidekick, yarns her way to solving the mystery, and get L.A. Confidential, or something like that. And so I think there's a little bit of an agreement there that let's not surprise you too much. Let's keep the surprises within the guardrails. And so I just think it's from an author's standpoint, it's kind of good business, because people only write reviews usually for two reasons: one, because they love the book, and the one because they hated it. And if that person picks up your gritty, expletive filled, violent, sexually charged crime novel expecting Murder, She Wrote, or something like that, they're obviously going to be upset. And the reverse is also true. And so it'll just lead to people being unhappy, and you don't want unhappy readers. So I think it's just a clear demarcation is there is a good idea.
yeah, no, it makes total sense, as long as you're clear, right, with the writer. And they may say, hey, this guy wrote something else, maybe may interest me. But knowing where you're going, obviously you wrote some kid stories, so you don't want to mix the the hard boil with that.
No.
All right. So talking about crime, I know that your background was as an officer in the police force, and so it's hard to find, especially I don't know on my show, which is not the main storytellers and writers podcast, I guess, but hopefully we'll get there. People that turn into writing after they're done with their career. I've talked to former fighter jet pilots. I've talked to neurosurgeon, brain surgeon. I talked to a lot of people that then will all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, they usually have it within them, the whole career that they have, and then they finally, they're like, all right, now I got time to write, and they are fantastic. And so a little bit of your stories, and when did you know you wanted to write eventually?
I was pretty sure about it by the time I was 10.
There you go.
So I've been a writer my whole life. I didn't really start having anything published until I was in my late teens, early 20s, and then pretty sparingly. It wasn't until 2006 that my first novel was published. And so for me, the crime career, the policing career, and stuff I did before and after, was one part of my life. But being a writer was just always something I was. It's like somebody who, is always a musician, but maybe they work at a bar, or they are an architect or whatever. They have another career, but they're also a musician, and maybe they play on the weekends, they do a little recording, whatever. And so they've always known they were, since they picked up a guitar at 5 or something like that. Right. And that's kind of how it was for me. I did have a period of time where I really wasn't writing much that wasn't related to my job, or I was also going to school full time, getting my history degree. And so I was doing a lot of reading and writing of historical, about the books that, history papers basically. And so, from about 96 to 2004, I really only wrote technical things like that, school papers and police reports and so forth. And then things kind of settled down a little bit. I'd finished my degree. I was kind of in a position that I was going to stay at for 2 or 3 years. And I was like, wow, I can get back to fiction. And of course, artists tend to be reflections of the things that they're around. And I was around a lot of police related stuff. And so crime fiction was what came out when that occurred. So I started writing a lot of crime fiction. And I would still say the majority of what I've written has been crime fiction in one subgenre or another. So for me, it was just something I knew I was going to do my whole life. And it was just a matter of how seriously am I just, doing it for fun? Am I maybe doing it as a light hobby, or am I doing it as a full-time gig? After I retired, from the police department, I was a captain when I retired. I actually taught police leadership for a number of years. I still do. And so I'm not fully, I guess I'm semi-retired. But I was able to take a much more active approach to writing and publishing. And so my output it's grown considerably. I mean, I think when I retired, I had I think I had maybe 7 or 8 books. At the time I retired, if that, maybe less. I think, 7 or 8. I was a pretty good guess. And I'm over 50 now. And so really, able to pick up the pace a little bit when you're not working a full-time job, or this becomes, a part-time job for you.
Oh, you don't know how many times I said, well, now I'm going to write for my fun, and then I end up writing stuff for work. Mm-hmm. But so you kind of answered my second question already, but I want to get a little bit more deep into that. So the first one was, when you started, when you knew you wanted to be a writer. The other one, you said pretty much write about what you know most of the time. So you are in the police, in that mm-hmm. kind of environment, and that's what you wrote about. But then you mentioned you wrote about thing about kids, and I think one of your latest thing is sci-fi. So how? I mean, it's easy to understand, write about what you know, but when you do research and of course, I think it's a good I'm not going to say it's easy, but it is easier, right? When
Yeah.
you know something. When you write about something else, you either just make up an entire fantasy world, which still require research anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you decide eventually to move from that genre that you're comfortable with something else? Is it something that click in your head, that you get fascinated by reading another book, watching a movie, and say, hey, I could do something like that? What's the process there?
A couple of things. I mean, I grew up on science fiction and fantasy. Those were probably my first love. I read a ton of fantasy and science fiction when I was growing up. In fact, the science fiction book that I just published, I actually dedicated it to a writer that I admired as a kid, because I was inspired by that author, and remained so as an adult. And so it's always been in my heart there, But you say write what you know. Definitely, I knew law enforcement, and because I was experiencing it a lot, those were the ideas that were cropping up and the stories that wanted to be told. They all tended to have a law enforcement or crime anyway, sort of backdrop. But I wrote 40 books or so in that genre, and I won't say I've ever gotten bored with any of the series that I've worked on. I mean, some of them have ended, so I don't know if I eventually would have gotten bored with them. I don't know, but some of them are finished, and I was never bored with them. And I just released the 15th book in my flagship series, the River City series. Um, I secret released it on my direct buy store, so it's coming out December 3rd. And I'm not bored at all with that series. I'm excited to go back every time I go back. So it wasn't
Hmm.
that necessarily, but it was that love of science fiction and fantasy from being a kid, from really enjoying some that I've read, some excellent films and TV series in that genre, and really, to me, crime fiction and science fiction are actually more closely related than some other genres, because both of them really provide you the opportunity to tell a story on the surface that has some complexity and action and nuance of character, and can be enjoyed just for what it is. But you can also examine things under the surface a little bit, a little social examination or social commentary, or explore the human condition a little bit on a deeper level. And any book will let you do that. Certainly crime fiction and science fiction don't have the market cornered. But the difference between the two, and it's especially true of science fiction, I think, is that you kind of can come under the reader's defenses a little bit, like especially with science fiction, because they're that's a made up story on a made up planet, and so they just accept it, and so they're not like resistive to the exploration of a couple of ideas that you might get into about whatever social condition or human condition you want to explore. They just it's almost like a backdoor into the psyche a little bit for the reader. And I mean that in a positive way, not in a brainwashing sort of way.
No, no, no. I understand what you mean. I mean, I was listening to some interview with some, very, very well known sci-fi writers, and they kind of pick some important social theme. I mean, you're building a new world, and you have that kind of like godlike power to make message and to highlight things that are not earthy. For example, I mean, it could be sci-fi related to not necessarily another planet, but I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
a city underneath whatever, another dimension. But I think that you have that opportunity to build the world the way you see it. So I think it's very philosophical. I mean, look at, I mean, the whole I, Robot series from Asimov, and now we talk about artificial intelligence, and that was in the 1950s.
Yeah,
We
or
still
look
look
at
at that, right?
yeah, absolutely. You look at a novel like Dune, which is
Oh
another
yeah,
classic, and,
yeah,
and the layers that exist there. And you can read a book like that and strictly enjoy the political intrigue and the action and the tension,
yeah.
but you can also explore the ecological, the religious implications. I mean, there's so many different layers, and so I think science fiction sometimes it just the reader is not necessarily as on guard as they might be in other genres. And then crime offers for a different reason. Crime just offers it because where crime is happening, usually there are social factors taking place or very strong human factors. In other words, maybe greed or revenge, those are very strong human factors. Or you could be looking at somebody who's turned to the life of crime due to poverty or to abuse, because they were abused. Or, pick your angle that you want to explore. It's there and it's plausible, and people are going to be pretty accepting of it, I think. And so then you get a message maybe that lands on a couple of different levels. And I think that's what great art does. Like, there's a lot of art out there, and people can look at, listen to, read, watch so many different things, and they do. And a lot of it, I think, just passes over us, and we either enjoy it in the moment or we don't. And we might not even remember if we read it or saw it 5 years from now. Like, we might have to think about it to try to remember, have we watched this series yet, or whatever. Great art, like, sticks, it resonates, it remains, it becomes it almost becomes part of the person taking it in, and it becomes their own. And when that happens, that art piece, whatever it is, a book, a story, a painting, a TV show, a movie, whatever, it's unique in that person's experience, so that it exists in a very unique way that's very different for the next person who might have different reason for having it resonate with them. So I think if you want that to happen as an artist, you kind of have to shoot for those deeper connections. And maybe you miss with some people, maybe you land with others. But if you don't want to be just kind of the popcorn entertainment, which, people make a great living doing that. And there's nothing wrong with a good, good romp of that nature. Sometimes it has its place, for sure. But I've always kind of been interested in trying to, like, make that deeper connection. And so I found science fiction and crime fiction are two very good genres for making that attempt.
Well, you talk about music. I can go there. You can write a song with 4 chords that just flip around, and they're just made to sell and catchy. But I'm not gonna go and compare that with Rush or or Pink Floyd or anybody else. I mean, or even not just going back to my kind of music because I'm older, but even great artists that you can find today. Maybe we'll talk a bit about music later, but I want to know about your sci-fi story. What is that about?
It's called Kemper's House. I actually have a copy of it right here.
There you go. Perfect. There's a space shuttle there.
Yeah. It's set at an indeterminate future on Earth. Kind of leave it a little bit loose, up open to interpretation, but certainly a while. And we have discovered the technology to be able to travel at 0.87 of light speed. And so this is a pretty big deal because now we can actually conceivably reach, other star systems, other solar systems. And around the same time that this occurs, and the debate about where should we go, what should we, do with this new technology, we intercept some radio waves from another civilization. So much like the early 1930s and 1940s when we started pumping radio waves out into space, that sort of communication, not a direct one. And so it becomes initially a first contact novel. Adrian Kemper, he is the captain of the expedition that goes to this system, the Chiron system, the Chiron 2b, which is the source of these signals, and to see what there is to be seen. And I was fascinated by the realities, the physics of the entire thing. I mean, if you're 300 light years away from a planet when you receive those radio waves, 300 years have already passed on that planet. And then it gets weirder when you get into a spaceship and start flying at 0.87 C, to that destination, because time passes differently for you on the ship than it does for the people that are stationary, to your point of view, on Earth and on your destination planet. And so by the time they get to the Chiron system, something, like close to 1,000 years has passed since those initial radio waves went out. So imagine, 2940 here on Earth would be, the earliest that the reverse could happen to us. What would our planet look like? And so that's what they encounter. And I don't want to give any spoilers, so that's where I'll stop on that piece of it. But but they do encounter Chirons. They do have an adventure there, and they do eventually return. And that's the other thing is, and really was the initial catalyst for the story was my question of what would it be like for someone to, leave this planet, go on a space adventure like that, come back, and have it be, 1,500 years later. So I mean, leave just as the Western Roman Empire has fallen and come back in the year 2000. I mean, that would be some system shock, some culture shock, some serious changes. And so, I started playing with, well, what could those changes be, and what could happen, and is civilization always on a linear path upward, or do we have regression that occurs, and what could cause that? And that's the thing about science fiction, is it usually comes from a whole lot of, why would or what if sort of questions, or how would sort of questions, and then you set about, kind of trying to answer those. And so, I mean, it's a short novel. It's only about 45,000 words. So it's barely a novel by definition. But there's a whole lot of concepts packed into that very short.
Well, I could have a series of podcasts just about that, talking about society and technology. I mean, you said, you talk about comparing the 1,000-year with our 1,000-year. But if you compare 1,000 years from now, which I think that's what you did, with technology that changed so much faster. I mean, we've changed much more in the past 100 years than in the past 1,000 years. So imagine that exponentially going, and I think that's where you're going. And I agree, it's the beauty of sci-fi. If done right, it's a philosophical reflection.
Well, yeah, and I'll tell you, I mean, I'll dispense with a dirty little secret that I wasn't sure if I should share with people or not, but I figure, what the heck, honesty is usually appreciated. I'm 56. I was 55 when I started writing this, but I'm 56 years old, and I'm reaching that point in life where two things are happening. One is you are starting to actually, like, mortality, the realization of it has landed. Like, you're not staring it in the eyes, but you can see there's less road ahead than behind.
You can smell it. I'm there. I'm with you.
So that has a certain impact on you. And then my generation is and I'm guessing you're somewhat in the same age bracket.
Pretty much right, the same.
Gen Xers, right? I mean, our generation has graduated from, like, the boomers are in charge, but we're getting there, to we're in charge, to now the millennials are starting to take over, like, and we're starting to be the older people, not the elderly, but the older. And so the world's changing, and attitudes, what were accepted attitudes, or what were social norms, are shifting in response to that. And it's unnerving in an odd sort of way, but in a very pervasive way. It's like constant, and you sometimes are surprised by just odd things that, like, this is the way it's always been, or the way I always thought people thought about something, and then I find out that no, my view on this is antiquated. And I don't even mean the hot button issues out there that people get upset about. I mean, even at a more basic level, just the day-to-day life of how things should be done, or what's kind and what's cruel and what's a good response. It's like the rules of the game are changing ever so slightly and underneath our feet, and it was a little unnerving. And so I was starting to feel, when I started noticing it, then just like when you buy a new car, suddenly everybody went out and bought the same car at the same time because they're a bunch of copycats, right? Once you start noticing it, then you really notice it. And so, boom, it hits you like a ton of bricks briefly. And that was about the time I was beginning to work on this. And so this idea of being a man out of time, I mean, Kemper goes away and he comes back, and it's 1500 years later on Earth, and the changes have been radical. No spoilers, but radical. And he is a man out of time. And even, the name of the book is called Kemper's House. And, he has a stone cottage in Ireland that he arranges to have a stewardship of while he's gone. And it's still there when he comes back. The stone house is still there, but even though it's still there, everything has changed, And so it's how it was almost a coping mechanism for me to write that part of the book, that piece of it to help.
I find it really fascinating, actually. I mean, I'm interested in reading the book because I feel like it's a kind of question I ask myself. Again, I was born in 1969, so I'm pretty sure that's around exactly like around the number. We run through from the analog technology we are that generation to the digital. Mm-hmm. Some people miss the train. Well, I feel sorry for them, or maybe it's easier. I don't know. Some other they stayed on it, and we can compare. And the new generation they don't compare. They're like digital natives, and that's a different story. Mm-hmm. So I think it's fascinating. I think we need this kind of reflection and look at the history and look at the future and make scenarios, because we can just go blind into it. And
there's
another helps you to do that. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Well, and my other passion is history. My undergraduate degree is in history, and I was fascinated too by the question of for lack of a better term, ownership of a place. I mean, and I was thinking in particular of British history, just because I was reading about Roman Britain, and before that I was enjoying the Saxon Chronicles that Bernard Cornwell wrote, the Last Kingdom, series is what he calls it now, and this idea that the Britons lived in on that island, and then the Romans showed up. And so for a long time, the Romans definitely, they owned that land, like they were in control of it. They built it up and they did all these, but they left, and so then the ones who were left behind had it for a little while, and then the Saxons came in, and then they had it for a while, but then the Vikings came in, and then they had it for a while, but then the Saxons pushed back, and so then they had it for a while, and then the Normans invaded, and I mean. But all of that happened in a period of like 1,100 years or something, like that, and 1,200 years. And so each of those stages, like generations and generations, maybe, 5, 6, 8 generations sometimes of a people lived there, and it was their land. It's where they grew up. It's, and so at what point, are you no longer the invaders and the usurpers and the conquerors? At what point do you become the natives? And yet there's a whole other people that still have a claim. And then here comes new people pushing in and wanting it. And so that dynamic and the idea of changing how the culture is affected by it, and those folks left behind too. Like when the Romans left, I mean, that was a mixed culture for sure that was left behind, and some held to the very to the Latin ways, and some used it as an opportunity to return to the old ways. And it's fascinating to explore what happened in history in a different, like almost recreate it and then run it again in a different, sci-fi setting, to see what happens. And you don't always control it. Sometimes you get surprised.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a story of how the Roman colonies then, at a certain point, the one that were submitted, they took a spot in the Senate as Romans, but they were not originally Romans. I mean, who are ultimately the original owns, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was a time where if you weren't from literally the city of Rome, you weren't Roman, and then
Right.
slowly it became all of Italia that was Roman, and then,
Yeah,
you
and
know,
and that applies to a lot of things. South of, I mean, Italy itself, we've been invaded by a gazillion. It's almost the same story than
hmm
the England,
yeah,
and you can see that. You can see in the different tradition from the north and the south and all
hmm
of that. So yeah, no, definitely you could write a sci-fi about that. What if, like, kind of like historical fiction, and
yeah,
and see how different.
alternative
Yeah,
history.
alternative history as
Yeah,
well.
I enjoy
Not,
that too.
yeah, it doesn't seems like you need ideas on what to write about because it seems like you're passionate about it. So what's as we get to the end, I have two questions. One, what's coming up next in your to-do list? Where's your passion bringing you?
Well, I'm sticking with the crime fiction on the on the one side because I have some open series that I want to see to at least a resting point where the characters are in a place that's a good place for them to maybe be sitting for a bit. So, fortunately, I'm in just about every series that means one book to get them there. So I'm working on those, and then the the one I'm more excited about just because it's new is a fantasy series that I've been working on in the planning stages for at least a decade now. Making notes and thinking through the world building and the cultures and
Mm.
and story and plot and character as well. But I feel like those are things that can come more quickly. But the other stuff takes a little bit more of a deliberate approach. So the series is called Seasons of Wither, and the first book is called A Burnt Summer. And I'm actually going to be kicking off a Kickstarter for it sometime in the next 2-3 months. Just kind of waiting on the cover art to be finished, and then I'll probably take another run at chapter one. Chapter one is I wrote a short story for an anthology that was also that it would serve as chapter one of the first book, and the theme of the anthology was a little lighter than the theme of the book, so I've had to adapt it a little bit. So I'll probably take one more pass through that opening chapter and make it available as part of the Kickstarter and see if it's something people are interested in.
Wow. I'm impressed by all the different angles that you're taking and challenges because my last well, I lied. I'm going to ask you another question because you just said that. So you're going crime to crime fiction to sci-fi to fantasy, and in my head you approach them in a different way. You mentioned world building. Obviously, you don't have a real one when you
Mm-hmm.
create probably fantasy more than sci-fi, but you're building a war in sci-fi too. So I mean, sci-fi and fantasy to me they're pretty close.
I think with sci-fi,
They bleed into each other.
sci-fi you might have a jumping off point that's pretty close to the real world,
Yeah,
whereas fantasy you're probably you
yeah,
know
yeah. You're
taking
right.
over from scratch.
Yeah, that's true. Do you change? How do you feel you change in the way that you write? Like if I take these books, right, 3 books of
Mm-hmm.
yours, and I read it,
Mm-hmm.
is it still you? Can I tell it's you?
Yeah, I think so. I do. I do. I think you definitely feel a different tone. You definitely notice uh, some language use that's different. I mean, there is a different
Mm-hmm.
way of writing science fiction, I think, than and fantasy and humor, than crime fiction. But I mean, I think there's a reason why we mentioned music earlier. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you can you could take you could take Mark Knopfler and ask him to play classical, and you could probably still tell it was him.
It
You,
still
you know,
has. Yeah.
yeah. And so it's almost like we all have uh, an artistic fingerprint
Yeah.
that's there. And so even when we do things differently, and the tone and the presentation and everything is all very different. I mean, because you have to put yourself into the art. So how can it be
And it should
otherwise?
be. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're gonna try to be completely someone else, um,
And you lose
You're
authenticity if you do
Yeah,
that.
exactly. And you can, I love the example of Mark Knopfler, but you can use it for a painter as well.
Absolutely.
You can ask a famous painter to write something that is out of what he normally paints, but the brush stroke, it's probably going to be pretty recognizable. So what kind of music you play on guitar? What is your struggles? And do you have the time? I mean, how do you have the time to do it?
Well, I play in small moments. I don't practice a lot like
Yeah.
anybody. It's probably why I'm not very good at all. I don't have great rhythm, and I have a terrible singing voice. I like to say, to be perfectly honest with people, I always say, you know, I love it when I love playing and singing. Nobody else loves it when I play and sing, but that's okay because I get joy from it,
That's
and
cool.
I've reached a point where I can strum a lot of chords, and I can find a song that I know and that I love that I want to play, and if it's not too complex, and I have the chord chart up, so I can see where the chord changes are, and I can, if I can figure out the rhythm, of the strumming rhythm, or substitute one that works, I can entertain myself, and one thing that I've learned is that if I'm feeling, down or dark, even playing dark music, or any music really lightens that up. It really purges those negative feelings if
Yeah.
you're having them. Music is joyful. I so admire the people who are good at it. I'm envious, to be perfectly honest. It's an artistic talent that I wish I had, just because I enjoy doing it so much, not because I would want to make money at it or show off, or
Mm-hmm.
I wish I was better at it so that, my wife would enjoy rather than endure when I play for her. And she's great about it. She'll even sing with me a little bit,
Nice.
but hey, you have to be honest about your own ability, and
Yeah.
that's why I say I'm a tortured guitarist. I
Yeah.
love it. I'm not very good at it. I've definitely plateaued at lower intermediate, probably, but I'm not looking to play any coffee houses anytime soon.
But
So
when people ask um, to someone like, are you a musician? Well, do I make money playing music? Then no, I'm not a musician. Do I play a little bit? Am I a stage material? Probably not, but I play. So
yeah,
you're still a musician.
yeah,
Let's define
yeah.
that. And there may be a lot of people that write in their in the closet, meaning they're never
Mm-hmm.
gonna show off their
Mm-hmm.
writing.
Yeah,
Are they
absolutely. There
still
are.
writers? Hell yeah, they're
Yeah,
writers.
I
Absolutely, and it's
totally
a
agree.
meditation. It's a self relaxation. I mean, if I feeling down and I find the right music, that's my pill.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
You may not be an author, perhaps, but if you write, you're a writer,
Yeah,
and so I don't know what the equivalent of for being a musician, but
I think so.
uh, I mean, I think songwriting is some of the most challenging writing there is,
Right?
and I think it's emerged over the past half century as the dominant form of poetry in our society,
Mm-hmm.
and while I do, while you do have to admit that it does gain a lot of its narrative power from being surrounded by music that lends the emotional energy to it. um, you can pull some good lyrics and put them on a page and just read them, and tell me that's not poetry. I mean, there's a lot of songs that I think would be considered that. And then there's the other piece to it, and that is that there are writers out there that are such good storytellers. They can essentially write a novel in a song of 49 words, um,
Rock
mm-hmm,
opera, progressive rock.
mm-hmm,
Absolutely,
mm-hmm,
you tell incredible story with that.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
but
So I
that's
admire.
why, yeah, yeah, no, and that's is it like a favorite band you want to mention or
Oh, I've always been a Springsteen fan since I was about 10.
oh
So
the boss?
mhm. Yeah, yeah. So, you look at a song like The Wall or Highway Patrolman or The Line. I mean, any of these songs that probably nobody's heard of, but they're probably 40, 50 words long, and there's an entire novel's worth of storytelling there.
Yeah.
And so I think you can learn a lot of the less is more approach as a writer from looking at what people are able to do with song. And like I said, they had the additional advantage of what the musical accompaniment adds to it, but even just taking the words themselves, I think you can learn. And I've written a little bit of poetry, not very good at it, but good enough to know that I'm not very good, or experienced enough to know that I'm not very good, but also to know that songwriting, I think, is another step harder personally, I think. So,
Yeah.
But it's nice to be able to, admire other people's art. And when you create art yourself, I mean, this sounds pretentious saying that what I write is art, but at the same time, when you create art, then I think you almost admire other people's art almost more in a way, because you know how hard it is.
Yep.
I mean, hockey's my favorite sport, and I know how hard it is to ice skate, much less play hockey. I mean, I played recreationally, and it's hard. It's hard to stay up. It's hard, all this stuff. And you watch these professionals do it at the level that they do it, and it's just absolutely amazing. And part of the reason that I think I appreciate it so much is I know how hard it is from personal experience. Some folks up in the stands maybe haven't strapped on skates or put on the pads and tried it, and so they think it's great and they think it's talent and it's enjoyable and all of that, but I don't know that they have the same kind of maybe it's a different type of appreciation that
they also like to give advice, right?
Oh yeah.
Like a fan.
Yeah.
Like,
Shoot,
what is it
shoot
doing?
the puck. Shoot.
Well, but I agree. I mean, you need to try. You don't need to try extensively, but even if you take a brush and you try painting something and you realize maybe you're not good at it, but you understand what it takes. Take a photo. Right. Like now it's easier, but if I look at like Ansel Adams photography in black and white of a sunrise or a sunset on the mountain, it just tells you an incredible story. So for me, everything is storytelling. I'm reconnected to the beginning here because I really enjoy this conversation with you, and feel free to come back anytime you want. I'd love to have returning guests if they, of course, have fun with me.
Yeah.
And we can talk about other things. But as we close this, I think it's clear that a lot of things, which has art, it's storytelling. I mean, we're made of stories in everything that we do as human in our relationship. So doesn't matter where it comes, and it doesn't matter if you're making money out of it. Honestly, just do it. Seriously, that's the message, I think. Frank, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Grazie.
Yeah, prego. And for everybody else listening, if you enjoyed this story, there are many more that I shared and many more that I will share. And that's an Audio Signal podcast where we talk about stories, storytelling, and storytellers. And if you subscribe, you'll know when this gets published. Well, you already know this got published, so whatever. I should have avoided that. But when the other one is going to get published. How about that? I'm not even going to edit that. I'm glad I didn't cuff the old episode and we went through this. So again, thanks, Frank. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay safe out there. Bye-bye.